Barron Trump called out on live TV. What he said next left the audience speechless. The studio lights shone brightly, casting a sharp glow over the sleek set of the Prime Hour, one of the nation's most watched political talk shows. Tonight's episode had been widely anticipated, as the guest in the hot seat was none other than Barron Trump. Unlike most political interviews that featured seasoned politicians or policy analysts, this was different. This was personal. The host, James Carter, a veteran journalist known for his aggressive style and cutting questions, sat opposite Barron, his expression unreadable. James had built his career on grilling high-profile guests, and tonight, he had every intention of making headlines. Barron sat calmly, his posture relaxed but composed. At 18, he had already been subjected to public scrutiny for years, but he had rarely granted interviews. This would be one of his first major public appearances, and the world was watching. James began with a smirk, shuffling the papers on his desk. Barron, welcome to the show. There's a lot of curiosity about you. People want to know who is Barron Trump, beyond just the last name. Barron nodded slightly, acknowledging the question. I think people assume a lot about me because of my family name. But at the end of the day, I'm just a young man trying to find my own path. James leaned forward, his tone shifting. But isn't that path already determined for you? You were born into wealth, into privilege. Do you really understand the struggles of the average American? The question was sharp, but Barron didn't flinch. Privilege doesn't mean a person is incapable of understanding others. I listen, I learn, and I observe. That's what I've always been taught to do. James let out a small chuckle. That's a diplomatic answer. But let's be honest, your father's policies, his rhetoric, his entire political career has been divisive. Do you think you can separate yourself from his legacy? Barron took a measured breath before responding. My father's legacy is his own. I respect him and what he has built, but I also believe that everyone deserves to be judged by their own actions, not by their last name. James wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. You say you want to be judged by your own actions, but let's talk about something concrete. Many believe your father's policies alienated large groups of people. Do you agree? Barron's gaze was steady. Every leader makes decisions that are debated. Some agree, some don't. That's democracy. But it's important to focus on solutions, not just criticism. James raised an eyebrow. So, are you saying your father was right in everything he did? Barron shook his head slightly. No leader is perfect. Every administration has successes and failures. But I think what matters is learning from those experiences rather than getting lost in arguments. James sensed an opening. You sound like a politician already, he remarked with a smirk. But let me ask you this. Do you have political ambitions? Are you planning to follow in your father's footsteps? The question was inevitable, and Barron had prepared for it. Right now, my focus is on learning, growing, and understanding the world. If that leads me to a role in public service, so be it. But I won't make decisions based on expectations. James pressed further. Come on, Barron. You're telling me you've never thought about running for office one day? Barron allowed himself a small smile. Everyone wonders about their future, but speculation doesn't equal intent. James decided to change his approach. All right, let's talk about something different. Your father has been criticized for his stance on the media, often calling it fake news. Do you agree with that sentiment? Barron's answer was careful. I believe in responsible journalism. The media plays a crucial role in democracy. But I also believe that sometimes narratives can be driven by bias rather than facts. The key is balance. James wasn't letting go. And do you think I'm being fair to you right now? Barron tilted his head slightly. I think you're doing what you do best, challenging your guest. I don't take it personally. James grinned, momentarily disarmed. Fair enough, Barron. But tell me this, what's the biggest misconception about you? Barron thought for a moment before answering. That I'm just a name without thoughts of my own. That couldn't be further from the truth. James nodded, sensing that Barron wasn't going to crack under pressure. All right, Barron, let's take a quick break. But when we come back, I want to know where you stand on some of the most controversial issues of today. As the cameras cut to commercial, Barron leaned back slightly. He had passed the first test. but he knew the hardest questions were still ahead. As the interview continued, the atmosphere in the studio remained thick with tension. The audience, now fully engaged, sat on the edge of their seats as the verbal joust between Barron Trump and the host, Daniel Carter, intensified. The cameras zoomed in on Barron, his expression calm yet firm, while Carter's demeanor grew more animated, sensing an opportunity to further press his guest. "Let's talk about leadership," Carter said, adjusting his tie as he leaned slightly forward. "Your father has often been criticized for his approach to business and politics. Many have claimed he prioritizes personal gain over national interests. How do you respond to that?" Barron took a measured breath before answering. "Leadership isn't about making decisions that please everyone. It's about making choices that drive results. If you look at what my father has accomplished, you'll see that his leadership has had a tangible impact. Whether people agree with his policies or not, the results speak for themselves." Carter smirked. "But let's not ignore the fact that many argue those results have come at the expense of the working class. Tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation that benefits big businesses, aren't these policies designed to serve a select few rather than the broader population?" Barron leaned back slightly, his hands clasped together. "I think that's a misleading way to look at it. Economic growth benefits everyone. Lower corporate taxes encourage business expansion, which leads to more job creation. When businesses thrive, so do the people who work for them. If we focus solely on surface-level critiques, rather than looking at the broader economic impact, we miss the bigger picture." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement. Others exchanged skeptical glances. Carter seized on the moment. "All right, but what about the social impact? Policies on immigration, healthcare, education. Many argue that the previous administration's stance on these issues alienated certain groups rather than uniting the country. How do you justify that?" Barron's gaze remained steady. "It's about prioritization. No administration can solve every problem at once, but strong economic policies create the foundation for tackling social issues. If we don't have a stable economy, how do we fund healthcare or education? If our borders are insecure, how do we ensure national safety? Leadership means making difficult choices that may not be popular but are necessary." Carter raised an eyebrow. "So, you're saying that controversial decisions are justified as long as they serve a broader goal?" Barron gave a small nod. "Every administration faces controversy. Leadership isn't about avoiding criticism. It's about standing by the decisions that you believe will benefit the country in the long run." Carter chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "You're a lot more composed than most people your age, I'll give you that. But let's switch gears a bit. How do you personally handle being in the public eye? Your name carries a lot of weight, and with it comes scrutiny. Do you ever feel like you're walking in your father's shadow?" Barron took a moment before responding. "I see it as an opportunity rather than a burden. Yes, my last name comes with expectations, but it also provides a platform. I can either let people define me based on preconceived notions, or I can shape my own path. My focus isn't on proving anything to critics. It's on making meaningful contributions in my own way." The audience responded with a quiet but noticeable shift, some leaning in with newfound respect, others whispering among themselves. Carter, sensing an opportunity, decided to push further. "Fair enough," he said, "but let's address the elephant in the room. Your presence here today, what message are you hoping to send? Is this a step toward political aspirations? Or are you just here to defend your family's legacy?" Barron smiled slightly. "I'm here because I believe in having conversations that matter. If we allow discussions to be dominated by assumptions rather than facts, we lose sight of what's important. My goal isn't to campaign for anything. It's to engage in discussions that encourage people to think critically." Carter leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. "A balanced answer," he admitted. "But the reality is, your presence alone makes a statement. Whether intentional or not, people will speculate about what this means for your future. Are you ready for that level of attention?" Barron exhaled softly. "I don't control speculation. All I can control is how I carry myself and the conversations I choose to engage in. A moment of silence passed between them before Carter nodded. Well said. The audience, sensing a shift in tone, began clapping, some out of genuine admiration, others out of sheer acknowledgement of Barron's poise under pressure. The interview had reached a pivotal moment, and both Barron and Carter knew it. Carter cleared his throat, preparing for the next segment. All right, let's take a quick break. But when we return, we'll dive into something a little more personal, your views on legacy, responsibility, and what's next for Barron Trump. Stay with us. As the cameras cut to commercial, Barron leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the discussion settle around him. He had held his ground, but the toughest questions were still to come. As the cameras flicked back on, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The tension had settled, but an undeniable intensity remained. Daniel Carter leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Barron Trump, determined to push the conversation further. "Welcome back," Carter said, his tone smooth but pointed. "Before the break, we discussed leadership, economic policies, and the weight of your last name. Now, let's pivot to something more personal. Legacy, responsibility, and the future." Barron adjusted his suit jacket slightly, maintaining his composed demeanor. He knew this part was coming. He had prepared for it, Carter continued. "For better or worse, your family name is deeply entrenched in American history. Whether through business or politics, the Trump legacy is undeniable. But legacies aren't just built on successes. They're also shaped by failures, by controversies. Do you ever feel burdened by what's expected of you?" Barron considered the question before answering. Legacy is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers a platform, a foundation built over decades. On the other, it comes with expectations that can be overwhelming. But the way I see it, legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you define for yourself. My goal isn't to live in anyone's shadow, but to forge my own path. Carter nodded, intrigued. Interesting perspective. But let's be honest, people are going to compare you to your father, whether you like it or not. Some might say you're here today as a deliberate move to solidify your position within that legacy. Would they be wrong? Barron allowed a small smile. People are free to speculate. I can't control that. What I can control is my actions, my words, and the impact I choose to make. If I were here simply to solidify a position, as you put it, I'd be giving rehearsed statements instead of engaging in real conversation. Carter chuckled. Fair point. But let's address another reality. Your last name alone makes you a target. You've seen firsthand how brutal the media and the public can be. From the moment you were old enough to be recognized, people have scrutinized your every move. How do you deal with that? Barron's expression remained steady, but a flicker of something deeper crossed his eyes. Scrutiny is part of public life. I've known that for as long as I can remember. But I've also learned that you can't live your life based on what others think of you. If you do, you'll never be free. Instead, I focus on what I value: integrity, responsibility, and personal growth. I'd rather be judged for my own actions than assumptions about my name. A murmur spread through the audience, some nodding in quiet agreement. Carter tapped his pen against his notepad, considering his next question carefully. I respect that, he said. But public perception isn't always based on actions, it's built on narratives. And the Trump narrative is polarizing, to say the least. Whether you like it or not, your name alone evokes strong reactions. How do you plan to navigate that? Barron sighed softly but did not hesitate. By being consistent, people's opinions will always fluctuate. Some will support you no matter what, others will oppose you no matter what. What matters is that I remain true to my principles. If I let every opinion dictate my direction, I wouldn't be leading, I'd be following. Carter studied him for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. You're remarkably well prepared for someone your age. Most people in the public eye, let alone someone as young as you, would be rattled by the kind of scrutiny you face. Barron tilted his head slightly. Preparation isn't just about handling scrutiny, it's about knowing who you are. If you're confident in what you stand for, criticism doesn't shake you as much. The audience erupted into a quiet applause, not loud, but filled with acknowledgement. Carter allowed the moment to linger before pressing forward. Let's talk about responsibility, he said. You mentioned integrity and personal growth, but what about responsibility to the people who look up to you? Whether you accept it or not, young people, conservatives, and even some of your father's critics are watching you. Do you feel a responsibility to represent something greater than yourself? Barron nodded slowly. Absolutely. Having a platform means having a responsibility. But responsibility doesn't mean trying to be everything to everyone. It means staying true to what you believe while respecting the perspectives of others. I won't always say what people want to hear, but I will always speak honestly. Carter tapped his fingers on the desk. Honesty is a powerful thing, but honesty also invites backlash, especially in today's climate. Are you ready for that? Barron exhaled, his confidence unwavering. I'd rather face backlash for being honest than approval for being insincere. The audience erupted again, this time with louder applause. Carter smiled, sensing he had just witnessed a defining moment. Well, Barron, he said, adjusting his posture, I have to say, you've handled this conversation with remarkable poise. Before we go to another break, let me ask you one final question. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Politics? Business? Something else entirely? Barron hesitated for the first time, then smiled. 10 years is a long time. I don't have all the answers yet, but I do know this. I want to be in a position where I can make a meaningful impact, whatever that may look like. Carter grinned. A diplomatic answer, but I'll take it. All right, we'll take another short break. When we return, we'll discuss what's next for Barron Trump and his vision for the future. Stay with us. The cameras cut, and Barron leaned back in his chair. He had held his ground once again, but the interview wasn't over yet. The next segment would be the most revealing of all. As the cameras returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio remained thick with anticipation. The audience had witnessed Barron Trump handle the previous round of questions with a level of composure that few had expected. Now, it was time for the conversation to take a more personal turn. Daniel Carter adjusted his microphone and leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and calculation. All right, Barron, let's get a bit more personal now. We've talked about leadership, policy, and public perception. But what about you? What drives you? Barron took a moment before responding, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. What drives me is the same thing that drives most people wanting to make an impact in the areas I care about. I grew up in a family that values ambition and resilience. I've seen firsthand what it takes to navigate the public sphere, and I understand the responsibility that comes with having a platform. My goal is to use that platform in a way that's constructive. Carter nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied. You say constructive. Some might argue that being associated with your family means inheriting both its strengths and its controversies. Do you ever feel the weight of that? Barron's lips pressed into a thin line for a brief second before he responded. Of course, there's always pressure when people make assumptions about you before they've even spoken to you, but that's not unique to me. Anyone with a recognizable last name deals with it. The way I see it, I can either let that define me, or I can define myself. A murmur spread through the audience, some nodding in agreement, others whispering among themselves. Carter, sensing an opportunity, decided to push a bit further. Barron, let's address something people are curious about. You've largely stayed out of the public eye compared to others in your family. Is that a conscious decision? Are you avoiding the political arena, or are you just waiting for the right moment? Barron let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. I think people assume that just because my last name is Trump, I must be planning a political career. The truth is, I'm still figuring out my own path. Public service is something I respect, but I also believe that impact isn't limited to politics. There are many ways to contribute through business, philanthropy, or even just by encouraging meaningful conversations like the one we're having now. Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. So, no plans to run for office? No ambitions to follow in your father's footsteps? Barron exhaled softly. I believe in taking things one step at a time. Right now, my focus is on learning, growing, and making the most of the opportunities in front of me. Beyond that, who knows? I think the best way to plan for the future is to stay open to possibilities. The audience responded with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Carter tapped his fingers against the desk, appearing to weigh his next question carefully. All right, let's pivot to something that's often overlooked when discussing high-profile families, the personal sacrifices. What has been the biggest challenge for you growing up in the public eye? Barron considered the question for a moment before answering. The biggest challenge is privacy. Most people get to figure out who they are without the world watching. For me and for others in similar situations, that's not really an option. Everything you do is scrutinized, every word is dissected. That's why I've chosen to stay relatively private. I value having a sense of normalcy where I can... Carter nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. But given your background and the influence you could wield, do you feel an obligation to step into the public sphere more actively? Barron's expression was measured. I feel an obligation to contribute in a way that's meaningful. That doesn't always mean being in front of a camera or on a debate stage. Sometimes, the most effective way to make an impact is behind the scenes, working on initiatives that matter. My goal isn't to be in the spotlight just for the sake of it, it's to do things that are worth the attention. The audience murmured again, impressed by his clarity. Carter nodded, leaning back slightly. Well, Barron, you certainly have a way of handling tough questions with grace. We've covered a lot, but we still have more to discuss. After the break, we'll dive into the topic of legacy, what it means to you, how you see your role in shaping it, and what's next for you. Don't go anywhere. As the cameras cut to commercial, Barron exhaled slowly, mentally preparing for the final stretch of the interview. He had held his ground so far, but the toughest questions were still ahead. As the interview resumed, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted slightly. The initial tension had settled, replaced by an air of intrigue. Barron Trump had held his ground against Daniel Carter's pointed questions. But now, as they entered the final stretch, Carter was determined to press deeper. Let's talk about expectations, Carter began, leaning forward slightly. You've grown up in one of the most scrutinized families in the world. Every move you make is analyzed, every word dissected. Do you ever feel like you're forced to live up to an expectation that you never set for yourself? Barron took a moment before responding, his expression thoughtful. I think expectations exist for everyone, regardless of their last name. The difference is that mine are just more public. I don't see it as something to fight against, it's something to manage. The reality is, people will always have their opinions. What matters is how I define myself, not how others do. Carter nodded but wasn't satisfied just yet. That's a diplomatic answer, he said with a smirk. But surely, growing up in the Trump family, you faced more than just public scrutiny. There's pressure from within, isn't there? Do you feel obligated to carry on your father's legacy, politically or otherwise? Barron's expression remained calm. Obligation and inspiration are two different things. My father has achieved a lot, and of course, I respect that. But I believe that success isn't about imitation, it's about innovation. I don't feel obligated to follow a specific path, but I do feel inspired to make an impact in my own way. The audience murmured, some visibly impressed by his composure. Carter sensed he needed to push harder. And what does making an impact look like for you? Politics? Business? Something else? Barron exhaled softly before answering. Right now, it's about learning and growing. I don't believe in rushing into anything just because people expect it. If I choose to step into any arena, whether it's business, politics, or something entirely different, it will be because I'm ready, not because I feel pressured. Carter chuckled. You're a tough one to pin down, Barron. But let's shift gears for a moment. You mentioned earlier the importance of engaging in meaningful discussions. Let's apply that to something broader. How do you view the current political climate? Barron's gaze was steady. It's divided, more than it should be. People have stopped listening to each other. It's not just about who's right or wrong anymore. It's about who can shout the loudest. That's not leadership. That's noise. And I think the only way to move forward is by focusing less on personal attacks and more on real solutions. Carter raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting that politicians today are more focused on conflict than problem solving? Barron shrugged slightly. I think that applies to more than just politicians. It's a cultural shift. Debate has turned into performance, and somewhere along the way, the goal stopped being progress and became winning arguments. If we want to fix problems, we have to start by fixing how we talk about them. The audience responded with a mix of quiet agreement and subtle nods. Carter leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "That's an interesting perspective," he admitted. "But do you think that kind of idealism is realistic? Politics is built on competition. Conflict is inevitable." Barron allowed a small smile. "Conflict isn't the issue. Division is. Competition can be healthy when it leads to better ideas and stronger leadership. But when it's used to divide people into sides that refuse to cooperate, we all lose." Carter studied him for a moment before shifting tactics. "Let's bring this back to you. Given your stance on division and leadership, do you see yourself ever stepping into that world? Running for office, perhaps?" Barron didn't answer immediately. He glanced briefly at the audience before returning his gaze to Carter. "I think leadership comes in many forms. You don't need a title to make a difference. Right now, my focus is on contributing in ways that matter to me, whatever form that may take." Carter smirked. "You're very careful with your words. I have to give you credit for that. But let's take a step back. What do you think your father would say if he were watching this interview right now?" Barron chuckled lightly, the first moment of genuine amusement breaking through. "He'd probably tell me to be even tougher on you." The audience laughed, and even Carter let out a small chuckle. "Fair enough," Carter said. "But in all seriousness, what's one lesson from your father that you carry with you?" Barron considered the question before answering. "Resilience. He's always been clear about that. Setbacks happen. Criticism happens, but what matters is how you move forward. If you let every challenge stop you, you'll never accomplish anything." Carter nodded slowly, then turned toward the camera. "We're going to take one final break, but when we return, we'll ask the question everyone wants to know: what's next for Barron Trump? Don't go anywhere." As the cameras cut to commercial, Barron leaned back, feeling the weight of the discussion. He had held his ground, but the final segment would be the most important yet. The studio lights cast a warm glow over the stage as the final moments of the interview approached. Barron Trump remained composed in his seat, his expression calm yet firm, while the host, struggling to regain control of the conversation, maintained a polished yet slightly rattled demeanor. The tension in the air was palpable. The audience, fully engaged, was silent, waiting for what would happen next. The interview had taken a turn that no one had expected. What began as a straightforward conversation had transformed into an intense exchange of perspectives, challenging narratives and questioning biases. The host, realizing that the typical media playbook was failing, attempted to shift gears. "Barron," he said, his voice measured, "you've spoken about leadership, resilience, and the impact of public perception. But let's be honest, growing up in the shadow of such a controversial figure must not have been easy. Wouldn't you say that, in some ways, the scrutiny has defined your life more than anything else?" Barron, unfazed, nodded thoughtfully before responding. "Of course, being in the public eye comes with challenges, but I don't let other people's narratives define who I am. I focus on what I stand for, not what others expect me to be. And I think that's a lesson anyone can apply to their own lives." The host hesitated, sensing the weight of Barron's words. The audience, too, seemed to reflect on the message. For once, this wasn't about politics, it was about individual agency, about refusing to be boxed in by societal expectations. Not wanting to concede, the host pressed on, his tone shifting slightly. "That's admirable, Barron. But there's also a perception that figures like your father, and by extension, you have benefited from privilege in ways that most Americans never could. What do you say to people who argue that success came easier for you?" A few murmurs rippled through the audience, awaiting his response. Barron met the host's gaze steadily. "Privilege isn't about where you start. It's about what you do with what you have. I've been fortunate in many ways, but that doesn't mean I haven't had to work hard. Everyone has their own challenges, their own hurdles to overcome. It's easy to judge from the outside, but real effort, real perseverance, isn't always visible to everyone." A moment of silence followed. The host, for once, didn't have an immediate retort. He shifted in his chair, acknowledging the unexpected depth of Barron's perspective. With time running out, the host attempted to wrap up. Well, Barron, I have to say, you've handled this conversation with remarkable composure. Whether people agree with you or not, I think it's fair to say you've given them something to think about. Any final words for our viewers? Barron smiled slightly, glancing briefly at the camera before answering. I think conversations like these matter. People don't have to agree on everything, but they should be willing to listen. That's the only way we grow. A round of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then building into something more genuine. The host, though still maintaining his polished demeanor, seemed to acknowledge that he had been caught off guard. As the show wrapped up and the cameras powered down, Barron shook hands with the host before exiting the stage. The moment lingered in the air, something had shifted. The usual scripted narratives had been disrupted. A young man had stepped onto a public platform and, rather than be shaped by it, had defined his own presence. Backstage, as he walked toward the exit, a few crew members exchanged glances before one of them approached. That different, she said hesitantly. In a good way. Barron simply nodded, offering a polite smile before stepping out into the cool night air. Outside, as the city lights flickered, he exhaled deeply. The conversation wasn't just about him. It was about challenging assumptions, about standing firm in one's beliefs without hostility. As he walked toward his awaiting car, a notification flashed on his phone. Messages poured in, some supportive, some critical, but one stood out from his mother. Proud of you. Keep being true to yourself, Barron smiled. He had done exactly that, and that, above all else, was what mattered most.